Are you sure you know why you travel? I mean, really think about it. Knowing the many costs of travel, and I'm not just talking about money here, how come we never stop and ask ourselves if we can get the benefit of traveling without actually traveling? And before you think I'm crazy, no, I'm not suggesting we stop traveling, just that we think outside of the tight box of travel. Stay until the end to understand why these are very relevant questions, even for our local and national economies, and to get a bunch of super tangible ideas for the next time you feel like planning a trip.
It is a very strong economy, yet at the same time a very fragile one. Given this reality, and in order to make our economies and societies more resilient, I think we should consider reducing our dependence on this sector so we can look to the future with a little more confidence.
Let my breath brush your ears. Inhale these words. May they fill your lungs and the atmosphere.
Anytime I see people question the act of traveling, they usually focus on tourism as a lesser way of traveling. But I personally think both travel and tourism serve valid purposes. They meet human needs, which we'll talk about, and I don't think there's a hierarchy in these human needs. They all arise from our environment, and I don't see why wanting to open your mind to new cultures would be more noble than wanting to rest. So my goal with this episode is to go deeper and question the way we think about travel from a more philosophical angle, to ask questions like, what needs does traveling help us satisfy, and how else can we satisfy them in a way that does not infringe on other people's sense of safety and freedom? Again, keep listening and you'll see why these are relevant questions. But there are two things I want to make clear before we start. I'm only talking about leisure travel here, not migration, not business trips. And I'm not questioning the individual, the person who goes on holiday. I'm wondering why, as a culture, we think of traveling as a given we're entitled to when it's actually such a marginal thing to do, if you look at how many people travel in the world now and in history. And to explore this subject, I'm talking to French sociologist Rodolphe Christin, so Rodolphe, who will be dubbed not by AI, but by my friend James Patrick, who was kind enough to record himself reading my translation of the interview. Rodolphe specializes in travel and has written several books about it. So let's start with him explaining a bit about the history of travel.
I would say that travel is a rather generic term, which refers to a movement which consists in finding yourself in situations that you don't know, in territories that you don't know. And from this point of view, it is an original experience in the sense that because of the sensory exposure to strangeness, your cognitive processes and your emotional situation are disturbed. And as I often say, humanity has always traveled, and for different reasons like hunting, foraging, commerce, religious pilgrimages, conquering new territories, adapting to climate changes. So I would say that traveling is integral to humanity. We know that populations spread and intermixed. What changed with tourism is that it was reserved for aristocrats who would send their children abroad to refine their education, a practice that was adopted by the bourgeoisie after the Industrial Revolution. A new social category emerged with entrepreneurs, people who invested and developed the industrial sector. And these people also adopted the concept of traveling for pleasure. I think we can accept this definition of tourism as traveling for pleasure, leisure travel, where people seek to discover things to have fun, but also to reset and sometimes even to heal. There's always been a therapeutic aspect of tourism. People have also traveled to enjoy the air of the mountain or the coast, an air that is more pure and dry, or to enjoy revitalizing sunshine after the winter. In today's tourism, we see this therapeutic dimension, a kind of compensation where we work and have a productive activity for a certain part of the year, and at some point we have some free time, the holidays, and we seek to use this time by going on vacation. It's a very commonplace expression, but it is not so common. Because in order to go on vacation, you need to have the budget surplus that allows you to go away. And not everybody does. So, historically, it wasn't everyone's case. We talked about the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie. And nowadays, it's mostly people from developed countries or the more well-off people from developing countries. So it doesn't apply to everyone at all. What is becoming widespread might be the desire to travel, because not everyone has the means to go on vacation, but many people want to. And this is partly linked to the expansion of an economic model, the market economy, and a type of work, wage labor. We mustn't forget that either. With the Industrial Revolution, a new class emerged, that of owners and entrepreneurs, and another class also emerged, that of employees, and more specifically, wage earners. In other words, people who had previously been artisans or farmers were hired. This didn't necessarily happen easily, and it wasn't always a very pleasant process. There were power struggles, and so people came to be hired by companies, by industries that assigned them working hours, and gradually a space for free time was created. Holidays. In France, the year 1936 is very famous and legendary. It's when paid leave was created. And so the idea was to ensure that you have time off work for which you'll be paid. And from there, the widespread adoption, or at least the attempt to make tourism a widespread practice, began in a way.
So travel has always existed for war, commerce, migration, but it gained a whole new dimension with the creation of the employee status and the concept of holidays, which made way for tourism. And here's that word again, tourism. But like I said before, I'm examining travel here. And Rodolphe's approach is actually very helpful in that regard because while most people talk about mass tourism, he focuses on tourism massification. Let's hear him explain the difference between the two, and remember, tourism means leisure travel allowed by a surplus budget, so that includes off-the-beaten-path trips.
What I call the massification of tourism is a phenomenon, a process that goes far beyond the mere effect of mass tourism. Mass tourism refers to this often seasonal phenomenon in which large numbers of people gather at tourist destinations that are specifically designed to accommodate them. And there is a herding effect. One example is the Mediterranean coast, which is just one of many examples of this mass tourism. So, there are places of large gatherings, places equipped with infrastructure capable of accommodating these sometimes staggering numbers of people, and with the seasonal component, meaning that when the holiday season begins, many people hit the road. So there's a concentration of many people in places designated for this purpose. Now, the massification of tourism is the fact that the desire to travel is becoming widespread and is spreading across different types of spaces and practices, eventually coming to occupy all kinds of territories as these activities accumulate one upon another. Ultimately, even when we try to escape mass tourism, we contribute to tourism massification. We end up occupying territories, backcountries, and more isolated areas where we develop a different kind of tourism, one that may be impact conscious if considered in isolation, but one that, in reality, when added to other far less impact conscious forms of tourism, nonetheless contributes to spreading tourism far and wide because it is in the nature of tourism to develop new destinations, to establish itself in new territories, as we seek out places where there are no tourists or tourism yet. And then, once it takes hold, once the trend is underway, these places become tourist destinations one after another. And that ultimately is the phenomenon of tourism massification.
Okay, there's one more concept I want to clarify, and it is exoticism. This whole questioning of mine about travel started during a trip where I had a moment of clarity where I felt like I was in a zoo, watching people just go about their day, living their lives and doing these very normal, unglamorous things, like working. But for me, it was exciting because it was exotic. It felt very voyeuristic, like I was consuming their reality or their lives. I found that very disturbing, and I still do. So I asked Rodolphe about exoticism, what it is and what it implies.
There is that thing of, I observe the world, a world to which I do not belong, to which I will never belong, because the concept of leisure travel certainly involves the idea of departure, but it also involves the idea of return. So a trip is something temporary. It's an experience that has a beginning and an end. Otherwise, we're talking about exile and migration, when you leave without really knowing when or if you'll be able to return. So, yes, there is this idea of I am just a passerby, which is liberating in a way. It contributes to a sense of liberation, of freedom linked to the act of traveling. And it is also sometimes unsettling and uncomfortable because we may find ourselves observing things, phenomena, situations, human beings who are, for example, in situations of suffering. And you find yourself observing that as if nothing were wrong or in a very detached, very casual way. And sometimes you feel a discomfort that is inherent in tourism. I mean, you sometimes find yourself in places where you have no business being. There's a book by Bruce Chatwin titled, What Am I Doing Here? And I think we should ask ourselves that question regularly when we travel. There's often an asymmetry to traveling. It depends on where you're traveling, but when you come from the global north and you travel to the global south, there's an economic imbalance that's immediately apparent, which means you're often a rich person walking among the poor for pleasure. And that colors the relationship in a particular way.
I think it's especially weird if you're watching people who are struggling more than you, like if you're from a rich country and you travel to a poor country. And it's especially super weird if that's what you find exotic and refreshing about the place and your experience there. But it also applies to, people who travel from the US to Europe and watch us enjoy our free time in cafes and parks and at the beach. Or if I ever go to Japan or South Korea, which are not poor countries at all, I'll definitely be in that same situation of watching people just exist because everything will look so different to my European eyes. So maybe it's okay to be a bit voyeuristic in that sense. Maybe it's just a weird form of fascination. But it does make me wonder, why do we travel in the first place? Where does that desire come from? Well, my hypothesis is that traveling helps us satisfy specific needs, which I think are universal. But if you're an anthropologist and you think I'm wrong, please let me know. For now, based on everything I learned from my guests, I came up with 2 categories of needs that I believe traveling helps us satisfy. The first one is escapism, and it can be therapeutic when you're escaping what Rodolphe calls the increasing unlivability of the world. So stress due to work, poorly planned cities and spaces, just everyday life struggles. But also when you're escaping difficult weather conditions, so going to a cool place to avoid the heat and vice versa, for example. It can also be spiritual escapism. In this case, you're escaping yourself and your comfort zone. You want to lose yourself to transcend what makes your ego, your identity. Traveling requires a heightened attention, which makes us feel present and alive. So it's easier to find that sense of transcendence, that awareness of our place in the world and the universe when we're traveling, especially in nature, but not only in nature. The second category is what I call growing up and down. Let me explain. The first subcategory would be growing up. I'm thinking about personal growth, discovering new aspects of yourself, stepping out of your habits and norms and figuring things out, fending for yourself. That's very much the case when you're a teenager traveling without your family, or even when you're an adult traveling alone, or to a place where what you know is pretty much useless, like the language you speak or your skills. To me, there's this need to step out of yourself and to question your own cultural framework in order to really know yourself, to discover yourself outside of the confines of your culture's conditioning and rules. So that's growing up, in a way. And the second subcategory is growing down. And for this, let me just read a passage from one of Rodolphe's books. To travel is to go back to childhood, when every aspect of the world becomes a source of discoveries. Exoticism undoes what we sense and interpret as evident. The world is new. We look at it somehow neutrally, with a specific form of open-mindedness. Thus arise fundamental questions. What is this? What is this for? What does that mean? Essential questions that kids and researchers ask. When we travel, we walk on the fine line between regression and regeneration. So growing down refers to this regression to a childlike curiosity, where you're surprisable again, where everything is novelty, exciting, and stimulating. As you can see, these categories are not siloed. What goes in the spiritual category can be therapeutic and contribute to personal growth, for example. But I think this kind of classification can help us understand what it is we really need when we want to travel. Because it's not always obvious. Just like hunger can translate a need for certain nutrients or water or just to reduce stress, the desire to travel can be a cue for very different needs. What these subcategories do all have in common is this. They all create a rupture from what we see as normal or daily in our lives, which makes space for what Rodolphe calls surplus attention, to pay attention to things that we normally overlook. In one of his books, he says that when you travel, you take some internal distance with yourself, a kind of distance that matters even more than the spatial distance you can measure in kilometers or in miles. And that's a really beautiful and enriching experience. So given all that, traveling seems so necessary and valuable and cool. So why even question it? Well, because it has some detrimental impacts, that's why. Let's look at them quickly. But before we do that, I want to show you a love song that suggests that there's really no need to go far when you can appreciate the person you love as one of the planet's most incredible natural landscapes. It's called Every Landscape, and you can find the full version at the end of the episode and on your favorite music platform.
Why would I fly high in the sky?
So I have identified 4 categories of negative impacts. Number 1, impacts on our country's economic agency and sovereignty. Travel as we know it makes economies dependent on industries that are not viable long-term, so it's a short-term profit approach. And real everyday people never want that. They want something they can build an actual future on.
It is a very strong economy, yet at the same time a very fragile one, as we saw during the pandemic when tourism stopped in a matter of hours. Given this reality, and in order to make our economies and societies more resilient, I think we should consider reducing our dependence on this sector so we can look to the future with a little more confidence, particularly in France, since we are one of the top tourist destinations. I also believe that there are regions that have traditionally welcomed large number of tourists, such as Spain or the south of France, where we will undoubtedly face big changes linked to the meteorological aspects of climate change. And then, unfortunately, we realize that we're entering a world where, geopolitically speaking, the security associated with the form of positive globalization and universal peace is shifting toward instability and a level of danger so great that tourism could also be affected. How? I have no idea. But in any case, we can sense that the world to come may not be as safe as the world we've known. So all these aspects should serve as a warning to us. And this isn't just a medium or long-term concern. When you live in the Alps today, mid-mountain ski resorts are facing this question in a very brutal way. Today, we're trying to prolong what we know won't last by producing artificial snow, for example, but we need to think differently. We're faced with the obligation to think differently. We aren't succeeding very much because it takes time, it takes energy, it takes willpower, it takes political courage, it takes being ready to ask questions and therefore being ready to listen to the answers.
These economies are fragile, so what happens in the 21st century with more and more geopolitical tensions like the ones we've been seeing, more resource scarcity, more anticipated epidemics? There's always this argument that the tourism industry should be protected because so many people depend on it. I think the people who make that argument are benevolent and sincere, but they seem to ignore the long-term well-being and sovereignty of the visited countries. Number 2, the negative impacts on local people's lives. So the presence of travelers can make resources more scarce for locals, like when water and food are hogged by resorts, and can just make life more difficult for locals, whether it's because they get priced out of their neighborhoods or because their space is taken over by huge amounts of travelers and infrastructure, like in certain areas of Spain, for example. Number 3, impacts on cultures and landscapes. I'll get to that, but first, here's some important information for new listeners. Just skip about a minute if you know the drill. Do you ever feel like every important conversation turns into just another petty debate and that we deserve better? Well, welcome to Make Sense, the show where I, singer-songwriter Leïla Six, interview people with super relevant and important insight to put our ideologies aside and make the most efficient decisions to build societies that actually make sense based on our shared values. I believe these are freedom and safety, which for humans comes from community. And by the way, whether you look at it scientifically or spiritually, community includes the entire planet. But these values can sometimes be a bit conflicting, which is tricky. So how can we shape a world that's both safe and exciting for everyone and on the largest scale possible? Well, that's a tough question and an ambitious goal, and it would be easy to get cynical about it and just say, well, the world's unfair, so I'll fight for my share and F the rest. But I don't want to do that, and I'm sure you don't either. So we need to understand topics that are fundamental to how the world works, complex topics that require our attention if we want to stay true to our values. Now, I tell all of my guests that I only want to have constructive, snark-free conversations here because I want everyone to feel welcome to learn, feel, and grow. So I'll ask the same of you in the comment section. Now, all that's been said, let's use our senses to make sense of the world and create more sensible societies. I know, it's too much wordplay, but I had to. So cultures and landscapes are often commodified and turned into yet another product to be consumed. Sometimes people exacerbate certain aspects of their culture in order to make it more attractive, appealing to travelers. They basically modify their culture to sell it. That's another thing I find disturbing. And it's tricky because it's hard to find the line between cultural exchange and appreciation and cultural extraction. As for landscapes, they are absolutely modified and altered in order to attract and handle more travelers. And to illustrate this point, let me show you a few pictures taken by Belgian artist Natacha de Mailleux while I read some of her texts. She basically took a bunch of pictures at the same place over a long period of time to show just how many people visit the same natural sites thinking they're doing something wild and unique. So in her project called The Place Nobody Went, she says, to enable tourists to reach the most beautiful spots, people build infrastructure even in places where humans would otherwise have nothing to do. When taking a step back, one can assist to scenes that are sometimes surreal. Humans want to see everything, even the most remote places on Earth get visitors. It is hard to find any site in the world truly free of tourists. And for the Theater of Authenticity project, she says, how strange is it that tourists are trying to escape social conventions in search of authentic and introspective experiences, but end up in the same natural environments, living the same experiences, and behaving in the same way as thousands of fellow travelers? Now, my fourth and last category of negative impacts is ecosystem, and it's going to be a short one because there's already tons of videos, books, and all the things about this, so you don't need me. So on local ecosystems, there are impacts like excessive waste production, often with insufficient waste management systems, especially when you travel off the beaten path, species displacement, resource extraction, and land use change, like buying out farmland to build infrastructure for travelers. And on global ecosystems, any impact related to energy production for transportation. So water contamination, air pollution, ocean acidification, just to name a few. Now, just to make all of this a bit more real for you, I'll give you an example of one type of travel that has a lot of these impacts. I believe spiritual tourism in the Amazon forest is totally benevolent. And by the way, I don't think people who partake in this would call themselves tourists, but it has negative impacts on local people's lives and cultures because it changes their relationship to the plants they use as medicine, which become a sort of commodity and more scarce for their own traditional use. On landscapes, because of the infrastructure developed to bring and host more and more people. On local ecosystems, because this increased demand for plant medicine contributes to botanical overexploitation, which threatens the forest's balance, and on the global ecosystem, simply because the Amazon forest plays a huge role in it. Now, maybe these negative impacts are outweighed by the positive impacts of travel, like discovery, finding yourself, expanding yourself in contact with other cultures, resting, having fun. So all 8 billion of us could collectively decide that we want to keep traveling despite the negative cultural, environmental, social, and economic impacts. But not all 8 billion of us travel, do we? So who does travel? Who are we even talking about here? It's difficult to find a precise number because movement is hard to track, especially within countries or in places like the Schengen area in Europe where you can cross borders without having to notify anyone. But what we do know is that not everyone travels for pleasure. Like we said at the very beginning, upper and middle classes account for the vast majority of leisure travel. Lower income populations are clearly underrepresented here, especially in international travel. Many low-income households do not travel for pleasure at all because of barriers like cost of transportation, accommodation, and paid leave. In many developing countries, even domestic trips are not a thing for the vast majority of these populations. I mean, yeah, it makes sense. Not everyone can afford to travel. So is it okay for a minority to follow their thirst for knowledge and excitement and discovery when the majority pays the price of this luxury with their basic needs, as we just saw with the different kinds of impacts? And I'm not only talking about developing countries now. In a lot of European areas, residents are fed up with the amount of travelers that is affecting their capacity to lead a good life, with dignified housing, for example. But traveling is so awesome. It brings us so many good things. So I guess the question is, how can we meet the needs that hide behind our desire to travel, which we already identified, in a way that doesn't take away other people's capacity to meet their own needs? I mean, let me add something here to ask you this. Out of all the human beings that have ever lived throughout history, and out of all the human beings that are currently alive across the world, Do you really believe that the few people who travel for pleasure are the very first to satisfy those human needs? Personally, I think that sounds kind of ridiculous. I'm sure humans have found many different ways to meet them. So, for some answers to this big question, join me in part 2 of this episode. But before that, here's some extra information and the full version of my song Every Landscape. I hope you got some valuable insights from this episode, and if you want to learn more from my guests, you'll find everything you need in the show notes. I, for one, thank you for your attention. I know you could have been watching or listening to a billion other things, and I'm glad you picked this one. Now, 3 things before I leave you. Number 1, if you liked the music you heard today, you should look me up on the music platform you use. There will also be a link in the show notes to help you find me on there. Number 2, if you want to help me make the internet a place for more constructive and nuanced conversations, you can subscribe, like the episode, share it, and leave a comment or review depending on where you're listening to this. And number 3, you can also subscribe to my free Patreon, to my free newsletter Night Sky, and follow me on Instagram or TikTok to understand a bit better the messages behind my songs. Again, everything will be in the show notes. All right, thank you, and take care, and keep trying to make sense.